Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie. Today we'll be talking about sword stances, of course. I hope it was worth it. I accidentally stood on a butterfly on the way here. No. Dead as a doornail. Anyway, that aside, the stances I'll be talking about will be mostly from Fiore Dei Liberi's Treatises. That's one of the sort of Italian masters from around the 1400s, that sort of thing. And a lot of them are applicable to single-handed swords, two-handed swords, and with some modification, can also be applied to things like polearms as well, and things like that. The first stance is one called Guard of the Lady, and it's quite simply having a sword on your shoulder. Whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you can still do it on your left shoulder or your right shoulder. It's something that, much in the same way as in a movie you might see someone pulling back to do a sword strike horizontally or vertically overhead. In the same way, by starting in a position like Guard of the Lady, rather than spending all of that extra wasted time pulling back and then doing some kind of cut, thrust or parry or something like that, you are already in a ready position, quite simply. Obviously it's especially good for high cuts, so coming around the head, neck, shoulders, those sorts of areas, but you can also sweep in cuts from underneath and what are called mezzani cuts, to horizontally around maybe the torso, places like that as well, just with a slight adaptation. Of course, usually it's fastest doing those higher attacks and a bit slower doing those lower attacks, so it can be tactically used where you either are obvious but quick in doing those higher attacks, or you can be sneaky and have your opponent think that's what you're going to do and instead do something like cut from underneath, which of course is something that you should try considering in something like sparring. Our next stance shall be the window guard. It again is something that can be used from the left or from the right, whether you are right-handed or left-handed, and whether you're using a single-handed weapon or a two-handed weapon. It's something that, as you can probably easily tell, is very primed to thrust. Quite easily, you've got the point already towards your opponent, and it's coiled up like a spring, so you can easily, whether stepping forwards or stepping backwards, extend a thrust. Very useful, of course, if you want to do that, but it's also perfectly suitable if you want to deliver certain cuts, albeit slower. You can also easily use it to wind in with the hilt and do something like certain parries, and even go into something like a sloping parry as well. So it is still a very flexible guard, but one of the most obvious advantages is the fact that if you do have an aggressive opponent who likes to charge in at you, keeping the point towards their face is a very clear deterrent against that. Our next stance is the Falcon. This is very efficient for attacking, especially powerfully, from above. It can be done, although it is obviously just in the middle above you, you can have your left foot forward or your right foot forward for it. It's very efficient at making high cuts, but you can also make middle cuts, especially winding what are called mezzani cuts around the sides, and you can even use it to deliberately feint as if you're attacking from above and pretend, before then attacking from below instead. It's not so great for parrying, although you can sweep down and still do something like a low parry or a hanging parry. It is much better for doing direct attacks. So, for example, if someone is attacking your leg, I would personally recommend, rather than trying to sweep down and bind with the sword, although it is certainly very possible, it might be better to take your leg out of the way and step back before then immediately cutting down on the opponent's head, because your weapon has to travel a much shorter distance and thus you can act much faster. It is a bit of a strenuous guard. You won't find yourself immediately getting tired unless you're using a very heavy weapon, but compared to something that's more resting, like for example Guard of the Lady, you will find that you will tire much faster when holding this stance, so it is recommended that you change between them very often. After that, we have the Boar's Tooth. This, very similarly to its namesake, is a stance where you start low in a position that looks resting, and indeed actually is quite good for resting, and you can hold it for a very long time, as opposed to similar stances like Window Guard, but it's still primed ready to do a thrust upwards or straight forwards quite easily. So just like with Window Guard, if you have an opponent who seems rather aggressive, it is a safeguard to help make sure that if they do want to charge head first at you, you can make sure to skewer them for trying. At the same time, it is very efficient for doing lower parries. So if someone's trying to do something like cut at your legs or at your lower torso, it's very easy to turn the hilt just slightly and then extend into something like a quick parry. But it can also go into something like a hanging defense, ready to do something more powerful. So it is a very versatile and I'd say more defensive stance. And at the same time, although it is best at doing something like a quick thrust, you can easily extend out into a cut, especially a cut upwards in what's called a sotani, and rather than like in some of the other guards where you might want to just use the true edge and sweep upwards, if you actually use the back edge and deliberately cut with that inside edge on an immediate sweep upwards, although it's obviously not the same as performing a stab, it's very quick and efficient and saves you the trouble of turning your hands to do a sweep up. Because if you do try to use the true edge and cut up, you're wasting valuable seconds by turning a hand and then cutting with that front edge for not much extra effect. For the same reason, and with the same type of motion, it's also good for doing things like deflections, so rather than directly opposing an opponent's sword and trying to beat it aside or just stay there like basically a improvised shield, you can instead carry your opponent's sword further in the same direction it was travelling, so that they deliberately overswing at your pleasure, and then you can do some kind of counter after that to cut them up very nicely. Our stance immediately after Boar's Tooth to try is called Long Tail. Quite simply, the point trails behind you, just like a, guess what, long tail. And in this case, it's actually much better for doing true edge cuts upwards, and it's also good for doing hanging parries. So then if someone's trying to attack you from above, you can easily just raise the hilt without doing anything of your point, leaving it dropping down in order to do a parry, and then you can riposte again. Just like with something like the Boar's Tooth, it's also very convenient for doing things like deflections, so carrying the sword along the same way as it was originally going, but too far. In a similar fashion, you can also use it to do other types of cuts like overcuts with what's called fendente, and also a Mazzani cut. You can use it to switch over and cut from the opposite side as to where you've got your long tail coming from, but obviously it's going to really telegraph your attack, and your opponent's going to see it coming far too long in advance. So it pretty much restricts you to one side at which you can attack from. Yet another guard you can experiment with is called Iron Door. In this stance, although it's not something that you would see with a single-handed weapon in this particular case very often, it is very good for resting. You can drop the sword point or keep it more horizontal, it's your choice, and then you can easily extend a thrust out from it, or you can do a Mazzani cut around the middle. You can also do overcuts and undercuts with a fendente or sotani, as they're known as, and it's very easy for parrying from as well. It's quite a flexible stance, but obviously the point is out of the way, so watch out if you've got any opponents who are ready to charge at you. But generally, it's not got any particular disadvantages save that. And it is, like I say, if you've got the point down, quite an easy guard to rest in if you're a bit tired. Beyond that, we have what's called the Crown Guard. Quite simply, you have your sword in a sort of middle position or higher, and you have the quillons out to the side. This isn't really something you're supposed to hold for a long time, or indeed for much time, if at all. Instead, it's something that you use as a type of parry, and you can deliberately control your opponent's sword, make sure to rise it up, and then control their weapon from there, and their weapon hands, or you can even do something like actually do a cut or a thrust extending down from it. So it's mostly a type of defense that is itself a stance from which you do actions from. You shouldn't really go around starting in a position like that. Finally, a couple of, I suppose you could call them honourable mentions, are what are called short point, long point, and two-horned. Now, I don't mention these as standard guards because you're not really supposed to spend much time in them. I mean, even less so than other guards, because you're supposed to try to frequently transfer between them anyway, so as to keep your opponents off guard and not have them predict exactly what you can and can't do at a given moment. In these stances, though, they're even more transitory. So, for example, we shall start with long point. This is something that happens with a single-handed weapon or a two-handed weapon. It's something where if you have done something like a cut and a thrust, and you have ended up in this position, it helps you to understand in the manuscripts that you can do other things like further extensions of the thrust by adding footwork, or retract back into parries. But of course, going out and staying in something like long point is very inadvisable. Firstly, you're inflexible because you can't extend any further in the cut without adding footwork, so your opponent pretty much already knows how far you can go. It's very easy to bind with your weapon because it's out there ready for your opponent to capture, or perhaps even grab it. And also, it's extremely strenuous. If you stay out in long point for any noticeable amount of time, you're going to end up extremely tired and fatigued, which we don't want happening in sparring, or worse still, an actual sword fight, God forbid. In something like short point, it's something that's obviously much less strenuous. Now back here, you can easily just turn the hilt aside to do something like a quick parry, or even do something like a sloping defense, and again do a riposte. But it does again, to a degree, tell your opponent how far you can reach and what you can do. Plus, since you're not starting in something further back to do a more powerful cut, such as in Guard the Lady, or Falcon, or even Longtail for example, you're going to have a lot less power, and your opponent's going to predict that you're going to be doing faster snipping cuts, and thus they'll understand that you're not intending to do anything powerful unless you change stance again. And then finally, there's the two-horned guard, like this. It is something that is, again, quite strenuous, a bit like long point, and it is something you only see in very specific instances. It can't parry very well, it can extend out for a thrust, and you can turn it around into a cut, but it's pretty much something you end up in, and you just have to learn what to do from it. So again, things like turning the hilt around to do a cut, or just simply extending it out for a thrust, or doing simple parries, are all that you can do from it. But it's still worth mentioning, because if you do something like a high attack or a low attack and you feint as a pretend, you can then turn the hilt around into this two-horned guard and then do a variety of things from it that will most likely be quite unexpected by your opponent because they're so rarely used. So that wraps it up for today. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and yeah, obviously there are clearly German styles with their own unique stances, and certain stances that are specific to things like spears, poleaxes, single-handed swords, two-handed swords, and even some miscellaneous categories, like for the Messer, which is a particular single-handed sword with a single edge and stuff like that, which you should have a look at and get a bit more knowledge on those areas as well. But in terms of some general advice, I would strongly recommend that you frequently change guards. If you always stay in the same stance for an entire match, or, you know, in an entire fight, whatever, then your opponent knows, like I said earlier, what you can and can't do. So then they will exploit that to their own advantage. If you keep changing at least just every few seconds, you can keep them off guard and you can open up new possibilities of things that you can try. Because of course, you'll have different ranges of things that you're allowed to try, best able to try from those different positions. Okay, and yeah, comment below what you think and have a good day, guys. Enjoy the summer while it's out.